Good evening. I have with me India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman in a first media interaction to a private channel. Nirmala ji, thank you so much for giving us this exclusive interview. Once again, the first to Network 18. I would like to begin my first question, and I'd like to frame it in the context of the last 3 years. In the September of 2019, you did a deep corporate tax cut, setting the agenda for growth, if I may. The same year, you delivered a growth-oriented budget. You repeated a very good growth-oriented budget even last year. This year, everyone was expecting you to deliver a populist budget ahead of the 5 states going into election. What was going on in your mind this year when you were framing this budget?
Thanks for giving me this opportunity to explain a bit more about the budget. I think in the mind of the Prime Minister, there was never this doubt that this budget, drawing from certain policy prescriptions that we had laid out in the last, for an economy which is coming out of the pandemic and showing very good positive revival signs, we should unhesitatingly give more help and stimulus that is required so that the revival is sustainable and the revival is strong. And therefore, there was no doubt in our minds from the very initial stages of working on this budget that public investment in infrastructure, that is the capital expenditure for the government, should be kept up. Even last year, we had given a good solid increase in the capital expenditure of the government between 2021 and 21-22. Now this year, therefore, we wanted to continue that momentum and also take as much as it is required to help the states to also move forward with their infrastructure spending. So from the beginning, I think the clarity in the mind of the Prime Minister was growth. Growth has to be ensured, growth has to be sustained, and we have to lead it, because only by public expenditure on infrastructure building, we believe that the virtuous cycle will happen, and also there will be a crowding in effect for the private investments to come in. So there was never a doubt other than this.
The elections were not weighing on your mind?
No, actually we thought if the economy does well and if growth has attained that kind of a momentum, the multiplier effect, which because when you spend on infrastructure and when you do capital expenditure, for every rupee that you spend, approximately 2.95 is what you would get as a multiplier, as opposed to when you're giving money through revenue expenditure, you get less than 1 rupee for every rupee that you spend, something in the range of 0.95 or something. And therefore, we thought it was important to have maximum multiplier effect, and that would have enough ripple in the economy, whereby the well-being of the citizens will be attended to. So if that is happening, why would any other consideration come in, even with the elections on? Elections come and go, but the economy, particularly at this time, at this juncture, requires that strong support.
Nirmala ji, if you look at India, it is one of the bright spots in the global economy.
That's
Today,
right.
Our economy is expected to grow at 8.5% next year. The same number for China is 4.8%, Brazil 1.6%, Indonesia 5.6%. Do you think that an 8% plus kind of growth is sustainable over the next few years?
If things go the way they are going now, in that gradually all sectors come up and are on their toes. And why do I say this? I recognize that even now the hospitality and contact intensive sectors are still requiring support, and that's been provided for in the budget. So our understanding is, if even those sectors revive as much as they would like to, and with support from government and with support from the systems, banking and others, yes, that is achievable.
You know, this time, one big headline of your budget has been this big capex boost. You also referred to it just a little while ago. Allocation of 7.5 lakh crore. You know, that's a big number, up 35% from last year. Do you think that this will fire up private investments? If that happens, you know, it could change the face of the economy. Are you confident of that?
I'm hopeful of that, because you see, I'm looking at it from slightly different stages and also environments. In 2019, for instance, when we brought in the reduction in the corporate tax and brought it down to such level which was globally probably the lowest, or probably one of the few lowest rates, we that year were sort of reminded, saying your corporate tax revenues have gone down, you saw it's not going to help and so on. But we had this great faith, and Prime Minister's interaction with the industry also was very reassuring, because people felt that that was a very positive, constructive steps. And what did it do? Actually, many of the industries, many of the big companies who actually generate wealth and create also jobs, so you saw them per media reports leveraging it, probably cleaning up their debts and so on. But that providentially has come of help during the pandemic time, that today you find many of them moving into areas of expanding their capacity. Mergers are happening, acquisitions are happening. You see that companies are out there to be able to expand their capacities, looking at the buoyant Indian market. And also exports are growing, which means export potential is also there for private sector investments to see the opportunity available, and expansion and also newer capacities are definitely going to come in. The last point on that is, you also see, in spite of all the naysayers, FDI into this country, in spite of all the speculation about other central banking authorities taking different call, whether it is the Fed or anywhere else, FDIs are still coming into this country in a big way. They are not FPIs.
Yes.
FDIs come in to be invested in, to be on the boards of companies and then take a call. And therefore, I think companies now are happy to be partnering with a lot of FDIs which are coming in, and increasing their manufacturing capacities, servicing capacities, not just to serve Indian market, but also be able to access global markets. And our PLI scheme also indicates that.
Yes. You know, Nirmala ji, if you look at the actual spending from capex allocation so far in the first 8 months of this year, it is at 50% of the allocation of 5.5 lakh crore. Now you increase that to 7.5 lakh crore next year. How confident are you that the spending will keep pace with the allocation?
First of all, this year has been, yes, we had made an allocation till December, you are right, 65 to 68% has been utilized by the departments for spending on public infrastructure. But after the budget was announced, let's not forget that we had Omicron, the second wave, not even Omicron, second wave in April. And although we came out of it, thank God for that, although we came out of it quickly, it also staggered that first quarter's expenditure into the second, into the third, and so on. So reaching 68 in spite of the first quarter going, April going in, April and a bit of May going in because of the second wave and the psychological imprint it left on people, for us to catch up with the intended public expenditure did have a lag effect. So I would think that shouldn't be the case this coming year. now that Omicron also is showing signs of withdrawing. I don't want to say it's gone away. We'll have to be careful, but still.
Nirmala ji, you've addressed the supply side of the issue. I come to now the demand side. The big issue is how do we really revive demand? So you've got your large capital expenditure program chalked out. Could you have considered cutting taxes to put more money into the hands of the consumer?
There are ways in which demand creation can happen. In our country, where the taxpayers' number and also the taxpayers' profile is seen, then you also realize that it is possible to provide stability in tax regime, predictability in tax regime, and that I would think is a very important factor at a time like this. You don't want to bring in elements of uncertainty, and as a result of which some sections feeling, oh, all right, I've got some relief, but some other sections feeling that hadn't come to us. And probably this would have a bearing on many others. Any exemption given is also just not for those who desperately need it, but by law would be applicable for others who probably don't need it so much, but because the system and the framing is such that it'll benefit everybody.
Yes.
So that is one point. And second, if you're looking at tax stability, if you're looking at predictability and making sure that you have not increased anybody's burden, you're at least making sure that people who have planned their monies can be sure that that is remaining unaffected. Right. So we in this budget placed a lot of emphasis on stability and predictability. I'm no cricket watcher, but I would definitely say this from my outsider's understanding. Particularly in a T20 match, it will be the opening batsman can have the liberty to smash hit and do a lot of good sort of risk-taking batting, and probably the end overs the fellows would have to catch up doing as much as they can because they'll have to meet the target and the gap which has to be filled. But there is a sweat toil happening which is in between the two. Yeah. You can probably take that situation.
I must say your cricket understanding is quite decent.
Thank you.
No, that's, I think predictability, stability, I would even say continuity. I think that's been the hallmark of your last three budgets, as I have closely seen it. Right. Let me come to something that is, a niggling issue, a global headache in some senses, inflation. Look at the US, for instance. Our consumer inflation has obviously stayed in the 4 to 6% range. But, if that were to really go up in the coming years, do you think that could throw some kind of a spanner in the works?
I think globally all economies are worried about inflation. And that's not to say, okay, so what? Does it affect your planning or not? It does affect my planning. I'm only trying to say this inflation, particularly because of certain global factors of metals being very highly priced, energy, at least the fossil fuel being very expensive, the production being cut down, the cartel or cartelization of those who are fixing the prices, or all that is having a bearing on all over the world and certainly on us as well. Yes. And we also have realized that we are at a stage where we are making a transition towards climate friendly steps, yes, moving out of fossil fuel. And at this time we probably even, like many countries, want to look at gas coming in, natural gas coming in to replace many of what was dependent on fossil fuel. But at this time, with international natural gas price also going up, you're facing a situation where you're planning for something at a transitional stage, and that also is now going to be dearer. And as a result, your planning is also getting adjusted as we go along to look at giving more incentives for electric vehicles and so on. So the long and short of it is, yes, we are conscious of inflation. The global price going up on essential goods, particularly those which are important for industry. And within India, essential goods, for instance, are pulses and are edible oils, both of which still depend on a lot of imports. Our capacities are still not growing in oilseed production. We are not producing enough pulses for this country as much as we consume. So we will have to get them from outside. And therefore, simultaneously increasing, we have given some incentives for, or we have a scheme through which oilseed production will be encouraged, but still, even then, we have to keep importing oil, crude edible oil or refined edible oil. And the countries which do export this do understand that India is a very big consumer.
I'll come to oil in just a moment. Just before that, the Fed Reserve has indicated raising interest rates this year. The US Fed Reserve's balance sheet is also likely to shrink as a part of quantitative tightening. All this will dramatically impact, sharply reduce global liquidity. What will be the impact on the Indian economy and our markets?
Well, I think if I can be fair in saying, since last 6 months, the Reserve Bank has been very keenly watching, and also the fora, the international fora in which both the Reserve Bank and Ministry of Finance meet with the international leaders, whether it is the G20, whether it is the World Bank, IMF meet. We've all been closely in discussion with countries to understand how this is going to play out. The lessons learned from the taper tantrum of post-2009 crisis, taper tantrum of 12-13, the lessons learned out of that are very fresh in our mind. So we are being sure that none of that will happen. We wouldn't leave all doors open like the way it was done earlier. We are watchful, and we should make all necessary steps progressively leading towards it, so that our economy remains protected to that extent.
Some reports I read, they think that you are a risk taker. This was a budget where you've taken significant risks. You agree with that assessment?
I'm glad to know, because earlier I thought the commentary was, no, this team is not yet, and I'm glad Honorable PM referred to it yesterday, saying that this very team about which there was this very critical observation that they can't deliver. I'm not saying I have delivered, but we are very clearly working towards making sure that Indian economy rises from this trouble. So, well, if I'm a risk taker, good enough.
Yeah, that's your humility, what you say. I'll come to oil prices, which you had just touched upon. So, with the oil prices at 90 a barrel and with the Ukraine situation that we are aware of, do you think this will put a strain on fiscal management? And if I take the question forward, what is your 3 to 5 year roadmap on fiscal consolidation?
I think we've recognized and reiterated in this budget that the fiscal roadmap which was given in the last year's budget is something which we respect. And in spite of this year being again a challenge for our consolidation measures, because the focus being on growth, we had to do this kind of spending and this kind of borrowing, but still we've kept it fairly aligned with what we have given last year.
Yes.
And we continue to commit ourselves for that kind of the glide path that we've given in the last budget.
So you are confident that over the next 3 to 5 years you will be able to rein it in as...
Yes, because partly you also see that revenue buoyancy has improved.
Yes.
People might keep commenting on non-tax revenues, not adequate is happening, or even for that matter talking about tax to GDP ratio, that the tax base is not widening. I'm very glad to say that the ministry, particularly both the CBDT and the CBIC, are working very gently towards widening the tax base. All this will help me to have a bit more fiscal room to operate.
Okay. You know, I think that the Air India privatization was a big achievement for this government. I think Neelachal Ispat has also finally found a buyer, you know. But of course, ye dil mange more. You know, so what exactly are you planning to do with BPCL? Are you hopeful that it will get done this year, in the next year? And what about others like the Shipping Corporation of India and BEML?
As I said in this budget, if you would have noticed, since right up front I'd said that I'm underlining the continuity of messages and policy prescriptions mentioned in the last budget. I continue with that. So I actually don't think it's necessary for me to list out everything that I listed out last time, but my commitment to it continues. Air India was a particularly complex subject, and in that too, to keep the transparency at every stage, to be completely compliant in terms of all the diligences that had to be done. It took quite a lot of working together with a lot of people, and that's how it should be, because we are accountable. And therefore, what I would suggest is my commitment remains, it continues, and I shall take things forward even on that account.
If I may just ask you a little bit about the LIC IPO. What exactly is the status of that?
It's going fine. It'll happen.
Okay. And this year, do you know?
I think the schedule is, yes, it should happen this year itself.
And how much are you planning to divest, and what is the valuation? Some benchmark?
We'll announce it at a time.
Okay, but it'll happen this year, and the money will come in this.
Yes.
Okay, that's great news. Having said all this, I think with Air India privatization happening, LIC, as you've just pointed out, the one thing I want to ask the finance minister is, why is your disinvestment target so low? You know, just 65,000 crore for next year. You know, that you could probably get, you know, a chunk of it could come just from BPCL.
I fully understand. Like the many other things about the budget, there was a time when people said, why is your disinvestment target so high? It's unrealistic. And you're right in asking me, why is it so low? It's a question of, I suppose, recognizing disinvestment will have to happen with all the process, and also the question of timing your disinvestment. I've also been asked why during the COVID, stock market has been performing very well. This is the best time you should have done it. It could be, but it's not just the stock market which decides on a public asset to be disinvested. There are so many other factors.
Yes.
I have to take everybody on board and move. So certainly these are things which, to be accountable, we mention it in the budget. To be accountable at every point in time, we have to answer questions of the media about it. But it also involves a lot of working together and taking a lot of people together and moving forward. So naturally, it does consume time.
No, in many ways, you know, there have been many budgets in the past that I have been tracking. Always the disinvestment figure is a fancy number, and, you know, you don't end up achieving it. So in that sense, of course, a conservative number is always good. Yeah. But I thought, since, you know, you had such successes behind you, you know, it looked like, but I suppose, you know, it's better to be conservative from your point of view. The other big headline, and, you know, everyone is wanting more from you on that, is the digital currency by RBI. When is it likely to happen? Some details that you could share at this point?
When is it likely to happen is something which I can only answer by saying one word: sooner rather than later. Because once it goes through the parliament, I've just placed it there, it has to get cleared, and post that the RBI will move forward to take the cabinet approval and then go ahead with issuing the digital rupee, I suppose. So it should happen sooner.
And it will have a new name, different name?
Well, we don't know yet. Oh. That's some call which subsequently the cabinet has to take.
Okay. Finance Minister, one more thing that is, you know, the economists are talking about. You know, they feel that you have underestimated your tax revenue for the next year. And why? I think it also stems from the fact that even in FY 2022, you revised it from 15.45 lakh crore to about 17.65 lakh crore. So do you think that there is a merit in this argument, that the tax collections actually could be, tax revenue could be actually much more next year, and there is an underestimation of some
More than merit, I would hope for it.
Yeah.
I would hope for it, but because it's a matter of hope, I can't really already guess it in advance and put it as I'm sure about it. It can't be sure. I can't be sure about it. I hope, and the indicators show that yes, there is room for it to be revised, but I'll hold my guard on it.
You'd rather err on the side of sort of caution and
Absolutely.
conservatism.
I think finance is an area where being conservative is not wrong.
Right.
I think being conservative, not too much, but being conservative is also being responsible.
Yes. You know, what I could pick up from the Secretary's conversations on television last night, is it some kind of a cushion to cut fuel excise in the coming days with oil at $90 a barrel? Is that something weighing on your mind?
I don't know whether if it is oil, meaning fuel. There are always elements of surprises through a year when you're dealing with the country's finances. Look at the past year. One of the big surprises, or one of the big thing on which we didn't want the end consumer, who were the farmers in this case,
Yes.
to be affected. You saw the way in which the urea prices went up. Went up unbelievably high, and we are an import dependent country, particularly when you wanted some of these very important urea matters, some of the phosphates and so on. You had to import them at that price, but that price couldn't be shifted to the farmer. End of the day, the farmer shouldn't be burdened by it, and therefore not only you're importing it at a higher price, but you're also making sure that price is upon you rather than upon the farmer. Is that something which we could have expected? Is that something which yes, to an extent we watch futures,
Sure.
we see the developments, but still after a point.
Yeah, there are imponderables. And petrol and
being
diesel,
ready for such contingency.
Yeah, and petrol and diesel are one such imponderable. I mean, you don't always want to pass on the price rise burden to the consumer.
As much as possible we try to
Yes.
hold, but petrol and diesel, not so much diesel, petrol for instance, the crude coming in and petrol getting refined and all that is now in the hands of the oil marketing companies. Government doesn't do much about it unless it has to come in to say, all right, I subsidize it, you take it and then reduce the price at the pump. Whereas the fertilizer, for instance, government imports it.
Yeah. You just touched upon the farm laws in the last question. What is the big lesson in dealing with this reform? It was a great reform, farm laws, but your government had to backtrack on it. What are some of the lessons that you've learned, considering that you were doing so many reforms in the last 3 years?
Well, more than lesson, I would think it was very gracious of the Prime Minister to say, well, if there is some section which is not convinced, in spite of it having passed through the Parliament.
Yes.
And it's a different story that there can be people telling me that in Rajya Sabha there was chaos and there was noise and everything else. But honestly, the minister stood up to answer. He gave his answer. He gave his answer in the Lok Sabha as well. And after that, the minister was ready to receive any number of delegations, any number of times.
Which he did as well.
But it was good that the Prime Minister took a call. And therefore, it's something which all of us remember when we talk about reforms.
Okay. The one market probably that sulked a little bit yesterday was the bond market. The bond yield sort of jumped 15 basis points, indicating that the borrowing costs are really going up. Is it a concern? Is there a concern around borrowings, larger borrowings? Do you feel that that is at all a cause for concern?
But I don't know if, to the extent that we have said it, is there an option? To an extent, the government can also pool from the small savings and, make up for somewhat your borrowing requirements, but the rest will have to be obtained from the market. But in that, we, through the year, keep announcing a half-yearly calendar, and within that, keep adjusting whether we really need to reach that much or can we be lesser than that. So it's for us to be careful about when we go out there, issue a calendar, but when we go out there and take it. So the concern will have to be the cost of borrowing. We'll have to keep in mind if it's going to be too expensive, but time it in such a way.
And have you been conservative on your disinvestment target? Do you think if you overshoot there, you would probably be able to cover up?
That, and also I still think there's room for improvement in tax revenues to improve.
Okay. So you're hopeful that that would
Yes,
that
look
could be
at
even more
the January GST collection.
Yes, yes. So you could be more buoyant there as well. Yes. A question that has been asked, but I will also try and just put it a little differently. Will you table a bill on cryptocurrencies in this session? And, is there a hint, in your announcement yesterday of a 30% tax on gains from transfer of virtual digital assets, that, cryptocurrency would be acceptable? I mean, would you like to elaborate? Even the Prime Minister had said that, cryptocurrency should be used to empower democracy, not undermine it. So what are your views on that?
See, from after the tabling of the budget in the Parliament, I'm trying to draw this distinction between privately generated crypto assets, loosely said assets, and what can be a digital currency. Now, private people, creative with digital knowledge, using the blockchain technology and the distributed ledger technology, can always create, but that cannot be the currency. They are some kind of assets. We don't know, we can't define it. I'm not going to define it here. We are consulting, doing a lot of wide-ranging consultation on it. Currency it would be when the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank of any country for that matter, but Reserve Bank in India issues it. So that is why we've gone to the Parliament to say, we put the proposal there to say that the central bank, the Reserve Bank of India, would issue a digital currency. Whereas what happens outside, because they are transactions yielding certain kind of profits, we decided to go ahead with taxing them in the meanwhile. But post the consultation, I will certainly be coming up with a bill. Whether that's possible within this session or not is something which I'll have to see.
On regulating cryptocurrencies, the bill?
I don't know what kind of bill will come, but will it be a bill or will it be, I don't know yet. I'll have to see what the consultation yields.
Okay. India has emerged as the third largest ecosystem for startups. I think our startups have done brilliantly well. In the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, we are talking about valuations of 10, 15, 20 odd $billion, each company. So, and you have, you've set up you've proposed to set up an expert committee to look into this. Venture capitalists and private equity investors have invested close to $70 billion last year. The figure could touch $100 billion this year. So I think really, absolutely monumental achievement in many ways. Could you elaborate a little bit on what this expert committee will do, who will be the members, and what is your vision for the startup ecosystem for India?
Well, in specifically 2 different consultations, one with the Honorable Prime Minister and one with me, the private equity people in India and the venture capitalists did suggest that there are quite a few things on which they expect the role of the government to be a facilitator and also we saw the potential in their presentation, and also very clearly they've shown it in the way, like the way you said it. They've supported quite a few IPOs, supported a lot of startups, and therefore the way in which and the speed with which several of the Indian startups could become unicorns. The idea, the innovative ideas they have are so substantive that funding has reached them, but the funding exists in India and that funding reaches them is the message that I want to, that particular point is what my attention is on. And therefore, when that capacity exists in India to fund, to be able to be professional enough to look at those innovative ideas for which they are willing to invest in, the discussions between them and the Prime Minister, when they met me, clearly proved that we need a lot more looking into the details, the granular details, which will make for a good sound understanding, and also ways in which we can come up with a policy which will be supportive. And therefore, the budget has come up with the suggestion that we'll form a committee of people who are well versed in that area, who can sit and engage with the private equity people and also with the venture capital leaders and give us some thought. We've not decided on the names as yet.
Okay. Any sectors that you have in mind which deserve a push?
No, I want the committee to have full play in it and for them to come.
And this committee will work with you closely?
They will be working first of all with the private equity leadership and also with the venture capitals, okay. And then they'll come back.
They'll come to the government.
Yeah.
Okay. What about fintechs and digital payments? They are another very, very important core area. What is the government's vision and roadmap for digital payments, and how do you look at neobanks?
First of all, on the digital payments, is there something which I need to say? During the pandemic,
yes.
Look at how Indian citizens, people like you and me, have readily accepted digital payments as a medium through which they can run their daily lives. And in this, there is no difference between rural or urban, women or man, or educated or semi-literate, none of that.
Yes.
Truly democratized digital environment. And in that, we were also successful in being able to reach out to every eligible citizen during the pandemic when the Prime Minister wanted monies to be given to them to meet up with any exigency that might arise. When even developed economies were looking at people to go deliver checks doorstep, yes. We didn't do any of that. We had accounts directly receiving the money. So India has shown great strides in the payment ecosystem, in democratizing digital adoption, digital ways of payment becoming democratized. Now this is a very big message which we'll definitely have to leverage when you're talking about India and the rest of the world. Other than that, in yesterday's budget itself, look at the various digital matters that I've spoken about. Digital university, yes. Digital education at the primary level as well, digital payment system which we already address, digital ways of registering your property from wherever you are in India. If a property is in X state whereas you live in Y state, you can still do it digitally. Digital ways in which you're recording the contours of properties, e-Shram portal where labor is getting registered. All this is digital. You're also talking about Aadhaar anyway, where we've reached near saturation. Now the idea is to make sure that all these digital platforms talk to one another. They should be able to communicate better and bring in that interlinkage between these. Now eventually, in the next 15-20 years, globally, your digital stack will have to be able to communicate with the digital stack of the rest of the world. So the India stack, as it gets built up, should also at various layers and levels be able to communicate with their compatriots from elsewhere.
Sure.
So the technology honing or sharpening and matching up to be able to communicate is the next level, and India's sure-footed on that. It's actually showing the leadership. Now with this kind of an achievement, you're already at the high table of determining global policy on this. And when you're determining global policy, you're able to be the leader to show that how things have to be executed and the interests that you have to have protected in India for several of these patents, for several of these things, which has now brought in common good, should also be shareable with the rest of the world. So the plan would be for the next 25 years for us to have that, lever.
Finance Minister, Prime Minister Modi spoke about making India a $5 trillion economy by 2024-25. That was, of course, an announcement pre-pandemic. What is your assessment, and by when do you think we can get there?
Well, I understand the pandemic has brought in a bit of a, drag. But this morning's PM speech also has brought in that comparison in a way. 7-8 years ago, what was India? Where was our GDP? Where was our FDI? Where was our foreign exchange reserve? Where was our level of, investments? In each one of these scores, on each one of these heads, we are at least 2.5 times better than what it was 7-8 years ago, despite the pandemic. 2.3 trillion today. So obviously, from now, if your consistent, predictable policies are in place, and therefore with consistency, you give the message to the economy, you're not going to be too disruptive in terms of taxation, in terms of policies which will hinder people, you're sure to reach the target.
So within the same time frame, or could there be a delay of
I would like it to be in the same time frame, but of course the pandemic and its impact is not something which I can hide or anyone will fail to recognize.
Yeah. The former Finance Minister P. Chidambaram says that your budget speech was the most capitalist budget speech ever he's heard. You take that as a compliment?
Well, for a person who otherwise, and the party to which he belongs, otherwise claims that 1991 opened up the world to India and India to the world, globalization was brought in, and that was the way in which Congress party always wants all of us to remember that we were the ones who opened socialist India to the world. For them to say this was the capitalist speech, obviously it will certainly be a certificate.
Yeah. And considering that in 1997 his budget was the dream budget.
And it is the author of that budget who says this is the most capitalist.
Finance Minister, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for this lovely conversation. Thank you for the first interview today to any television channel. We hope to keep the conversation going. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
The FM interview.